We'll start with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everybody. And today is June 15th, 2013. Okay, so the last class we had was on the Dhananjaya Sutta, or Dhananjani Sutta. This is the Sutta number 97 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And we saw in that sutta that the Venerable Sariputta is teaching or sort of guiding the Brahmin Dhananjani on his deathbed, and he gives him instructions, sort of leading him to higher and higher realms. And then he teaches Dhananjani the way to the Brahma-world, which is the practice of the 4 Brahma-viharas, the divine abodes or the 4 sublime states. And this is boundless loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. And then Dhananjani passes away and he is reborn in the Brahma-world. But then the Buddha sort of subtly rebukes Sariputta for guiding Dhananjani only up to the Brahma-world. He says to the Sangha that Sariputta has established the Brahmin Dhananjani in the inferior or lower Brahma-world. Then he got up from his seat and left while there was still more to be done. So the implication is that Dhananjani had the potential to make at least the breakthrough to the comprehension or understanding of the Dhamma through insight, and perhaps realizing the stage of stream entry or even more than that. But Sariputta was just content to guide Dhananjani to rebirth in the Brahma-world and didn't give him the teachings on insight or wisdom that would lead him to one of the stages of penetration, the stages of realization, from stream entry to the higher stages. Okay, so when I was looking through this sutta, I thought that it would be interesting to bring together a number of suttas from the middle-length discourses and also some from the Antidote Nikaya, which deal with the practice of the Brahma-viharas in order to get a sort of a broad view of their place in the Buddha's path. And an interesting contrast with the Dhananjani Sutta is a sutta that comes just 2 places later in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the Subha Sutta. It's a discourse between the Buddha and a young Brahmin by the name of Subha. I'm not going to go through the whole sutta since it deals with a very variety of topics, many of them of special concern to the Brahmins. But when we come to passage or section 22, starting on with section 22 on page 815. 815. Okay, at the very bottom of this of page 815, at a certain point in the conversation, the Brahmin student Subha says to the Blessed One, he says, I have heard that the recluse Gautama knows the path to the company of Brahma. And then the Buddha illustrates his skill in knowing the path to the company of Brahma with a sort of very down-to-earth simile. So he asks the Brahmin whether the village of Nalakara is near or far, and Subha says that the village Nalakara is nearby. And then the Buddha says, suppose there was a man who was born and raised in Nalakara, and as soon as he had left the village of Nalakara, somebody asked him about the path to the village. Would that man have any hesitation in reply? And so Subha says, no. And why is that? Because that man has been born and raised in Nalakara and is well acquainted with all the paths to the village. Okay, so I'm born and raised in Brooklyn. Well, I don't know all of the streets in Brooklyn, but I know the streets in Borough Park. So if somebody asks me the way to PS 160, my elementary school, I could tell them any street to go to PS 160. Okay, so then the Buddha says that still a man born, so this man who's born and raised in Nalakara and is well acquainted with the village, won't have any hesitation, but you ask him how to get to the village, he could tell you very easily. And so then the Buddha says, in the same way that if somebody were to ask the Tathagata, the Buddha, about the Brahma-world or the way leading to the Brahma-world, the Buddha would not have any hesitation in answering, because he says, I understand Brahma, I understand the Brahma-world, I understand the way leading to the Brahma-world, and I understand how one should practice to gain rebirth in the Brahma-world. So the Buddha would know all of this through his full enlightenment, and also no doubt because, if we know the Jataka literature, even some of the Sutta literature, we know that in many of his past lives, the Buddha had practiced the way to the Brahma world and had been reborn in the Brahma world many times as Mahabrahma, one of the highest ranking deity in the Brahma world. Okay, so then Subha asks the Buddha, please teach me the path to the company of Brahma. Okay, so then the Buddha says, I'll teach you, you listen and pay close attention to what I shall say. Okay, then the Buddha enters upon his teaching. So I'm now in paragraph 24. The Buddha says, what is the path to the company of Brahma? So here a monk abides, pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with loving kindness, so the second, the third, the fourth, above, below, and everywhere, all is to himself. He abides, pervading the whole world with a mind of loving kindness, abundant, exalted, immeasurable, without hostility and without ill will. So that is the instruction for the development of loving kindness that we find in the suttas. And now I have to add just some word about this. In the Buddhist tradition, when we teach the meditation on loving kindness, we begin in a very graduated, step-by-step, we use a graduated step-by-step procedure. Like if you look in the suttas, how the Buddha teaches loving kindness, it's always in this way. And so there are some people who say we should hold exactly to what the Buddha taught. And so the way to practice loving kindness is you just sit down and start extending loving kindness to all the different directions. But to my way of thinking, this is a little bit like if one looks in the suttas, how does one practice the jhanas? The Buddha says the monk sits down, he dispels the 5 hindrances, and then boom, he enters the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, just like that. But you know, if you want to practice to the attainment of jhana, you have to take a meditation subject that leads to jhana, and you have to know how to work with that meditation subject from from the A, B, C's up to the X, Y, Z's. And so in the instructions for the practice of loving kindness, the ancient teachers have developed a method, kind of step-by-step method, a very graduated method, which is a little bit like teaching the ABCs of how to read. Well, like if somebody wants to study nuclear physics, you don't begin by teaching them nuclear physics, but they have to begin with, what do they call us, basic mechanical physics? Forces. I did 3 weeks of physics and then of high school physics and dropped out. So I have no authority to explain how they teach physics. Okay, so the teachers, the ancient teachers, have devised a method of a very gradual, step-by-step method of developing the loving kindness meditation, which involves taking people in different categories or groups, oneself, then usually then they take a dear and respected person, like a benefactor, then a very close person, like a dear friend, then a neutral person, then finally the hostile person or the enemy. And then one develops loving kindness first to oneself, then to the dear and respected person, then to the close person, then the neutral person, finally the hostile person, and then one works gradually to spread or extend loving kindness to different geographical regions, then to the different to the 6 directions, and finally to the all-encompassing world. Okay, so what we find described in the suttas, where the Buddha just mentions extending loving kindness to the different directions, well, I think we should understand this to be a kind of advanced practice for somebody who has already established the foundations by working step by step through the graduated process. I know some of my good friends say, don't practice in the graduated way, that's just commentary, but just go directly into extending loving kindness to the different directions. If somebody can do that and succeed in it, well and good. No need to use the graduated step-by-step method. It's just like you get sometimes kids who pick up physics very quickly, and then they can go into nuclear physics, quantum mechanics. But those of us who drop out of high school physics after 3 weeks, if we decide to persist, then we would have to learn the laws of mechanics, Newtonian physics, and then maybe if after 3 or 4 years, then we can go on to nuclear physics. Okay, so here the Buddha is teaching the practice that leads to the company of Brahma. So first, he goes through the formula of loving kindness. And then he says, when the deliverance or liberation of mind by loving kindness is developed in this way, no limiting action remains there, none persists there. Okay, first I'll take the simile, then give an explanation. So just as a vigorous trumpeter who's playing the trumpet could make himself heard without difficulty in the four directions, so when the deliverance of mind by loving kindness is developed in this way, no limiting action remains there, none persists there. Okay, now what is meant here by a limiting action, or the Pali expression is, I think it's pamanakatta kamang. Yeah, pamanakattang kamang. So this means a karma that pertains to the sense sphere, the sensuous realm of existence. And normally for most people, ordinary people, all of the actions or karma we create pertain to the sense sphere. And so when its rebirth process is underway, then the karma that's going to determine our rebirth will be a karma of the sense sphere. But the Buddha is saying that when somebody develops the Brahma-vihara of loving kindness, when he develops the meditation of loving kindness, up to the level of a Brahma-vihara, up to the level of what is called the deliverance of mind by loving kindness. And this means developing loving kindness up to a level that corresponds to one of the jhanas. Usually in the Pali commentaries, they say that one can develop loving kindness up to the level of the first three jhanas. First jhana, second jhana, or third jhana. And so if one develops loving kindness up to the level of jhana, and one maintains that Brahma-vihara up to the time of one's death, so that one could enter it whenever one wants to, up to the time of one's death, so that it's very strong, then when the death process is taking place, the karma, the wholesome karma generated through the liberation of mind by loving kindness will take precedence over all of the other karmas. So it will push away the karmas that relate to the sense sphere, and it will take on the governing role in the rebirth process, and so it will propel the mind to rebirth in one of the higher realms, the Brahma-world. It doesn't mean that the karmas that we've created in the sense sphere karmas, that they're completely destroyed and can no longer produce their results. They still will remain in the mental continuum. They'll still have the potential of those karmas still persist there. But those karmas will not govern the rebirth process. And I don't think they'll produce their results after rebirth in the Brahma-world. But after one passes away from the Brahma-world, then one can take rebirth elsewhere, even back into the human world or in the lower worlds, and then those karmas will have their opportunity to ripen. So one doesn't escape them altogether, but when one develops the liberation of mind by loving kindness and maintains it through the course of one's life, then that becomes the determinant of rebirth into the Brahma world in the next existence. Okay, so this is first explained on the basis of metta or loving kindness, and then the Buddha continues by using the same formulation in regard to the next three divine abodes. The monk pervades one quarter with a mind of compassion, a mind of mudita, or altruistic joy, and then with a mind of upekkha, equanimity. And so again, in each case, the Buddha says that when this deliverance of mind by compassion, altruistic joy, equanimity is developed in this way, then no limiting or finite karma of the sense sphere remains there. So this too is the path to the company of Brahma. Okay, then the Brahmin student, Subha, is delighted with the Buddha's exposition. He expresses his now confidence or trust in the Buddha. He goes for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then he says, and now, Master Gautama, we depart, we are busy, and we have much to do. And then the Buddha says, you may go, student, at your own convenience. Well, what is interesting about this passage? Compare it to the Dhananjani Sutta.
He's letting him leave with more to be done.
Excuse me?
He's letting him leave with more to be done.
Yeah, the Buddha doesn't say, wait a minute. Wait a minute, young man. I'm not finished my exposition yet. I still have a few more things to tell you. But he says, you may go, student, at your own convenience. So if Sariputta were present, what would Sariputta be saying to the Buddha? What? Depends when. Let's put the time considerations aside.
Well, I would say that this is an interesting. I guess we cannot never surpass the Buddha's knowledge, I guess, and his understanding. I mean, no one can surpass that. So
yeah, but let's just put that put that aside for the time being.
So Sariputta would ask, why did you say let him go if there's more to be done? Then that would be my question if I were Sariputta.
Yeah. So why did the Buddha rebuke Sariputta for leaving Dhananjani, teaching him only the path to the Brahma-world, and then departing when there was more to be done? But now the Buddha teaches Subha the path to the Brahma-world, and of course, then Subha says, I'm very busy, I have to go, and the Buddha says, okay, you can go. Of course, we can say that the Buddha knew that Subha's business was extremely urgent, but then you could say that there would be nothing more urgent than teaching him the way to liberation. Michael, take the microphone.
Originally, we said that there was more to be done because there was literally more to be done in the sense that that person would be able to take the teachings. But in this case, if that's the case the first time, then one can assume in this case that he's not prepared to go further and that this is the appropriate place to stop.
Okay, that's an excellent answer. That's exactly what I was thinking myself. Just to repeat for the microphone, for the tape recorder, he said that under these conditions, the Buddha would have known that he had taught as much as Subha was capable of understanding or grasping, and that it was not the occasion to try to present him with further teachings that would have led him to some realization. Johnny wanted to add something.
Subha is not dying yet. There's still time for semester break.
In a way, that's true. But also the texts, sometimes they say that death can come at any moment. But probably, as Michael said, the Buddha would have known that Subha's faculties were probably not yet ripe enough to be able to penetrate into the truth of the Dhamma. And so he gave him enough to sort of lead him in a wholesome direction. I don't recall any suttas where the Buddha again encounters Subha and directs him to a world-transcending realization. But maybe my memory is a little cloudy on that point.
Also, I think there's a difference between leading someone who's still listening to you, like in Shariputra's thing, and someone who says, I have to go. That person is kind of, that's an indication
that is true.
of unreadiness.
And I don't recall any passage in the sutta where somebody declares, somebody who's in a discussion with the Buddha, a layperson says, I'm very busy, I have to go. And then the Buddha says to him, don't be in a hurry, stay a little while longer. I don't recall any passage like that. Please take the microphone.
My question is, maybe getting off a little topic, but my question is, why does, coming from a secular person and this Brahma world and the Devas, it's kind of very foreign to me in a way. And would you say that the Brahma world that he uses the metaphors and similes is within the context of Hinduism, so people can understand that this achievement of Brahma world is capable for humans, but then you have to do more in order to liberate. You have to go beyond it. So was that the Buddhist idea of using this context?
Okay, I guess the basic idea is the Buddha sort of using these premises and this worldview of Hinduism as a basis for teaching the Brahmins. Is that the point of the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, what we call Hinduism today didn't really exist at the time of the Buddha. What was existing at the time of the Buddha is what we would call, or what scholars call Brahmanism, which would be the religion of the Brahmins, founded upon, particularly on the Vedas and some of the texts that developed out of the Vedas. And then there would have been at the popular level a wide number of cults, probably centered around nature deities, or even some higher deities. And then in time, these different streams of religiosity, spirituality, merged to form the basis for what we now call Hinduism. But this would have taken place maybe by about the 1st century BC, or even after the beginning of the Christian era. Okay, but it seems here that the Buddha, when he's teaching Brahmins, he often uses the framework of the Brahma world for teaching them, in order as a kind of accommodation to their point of view. But also, when the Buddha is teaching his own followers and the monks, he does make reference to the Brahma world and teaches the path to the Brahma world. But as we could see from some of these suttas, for the Brahmins, like their aspiration was to be reborn in the Brahma world. For them, that was the supreme goal, at least the way it's presented in the Buddhist texts. But for the Buddha, there is such a thing as the Brahma world, and the 4 divine abodes is the path to the Brahma world. But for the Buddha, as we'll see from some of the other suttas, this is not the ultimate goal, but it's a kind of temporary station. Okay, any questions or comments coming out from this passage before we go on? Okay, so let's go on to some of the other suttas deal with the divine abodes. Okay, let us take sutta number 83. Again, I'm not going to take the whole sutta, but I'm going to pick up here. On paragraph 17. Okay, this is a sutta with a somewhat legendary character to it, where the Buddha is speaking about some of the kings who ruled at the place called Mithila. It's a place in northern India, in the distant past, thousands and thousands of years in the past. And he explains how each of these kings, at a certain point in their career, they renounced the household life when they were growing old, and they became ascetics, and they practiced the 4 Brahma-viharas, and they were reborn in the Brahma-world. And then finally he comes to a king named Nimi, who after ruling for many hundreds of years, many thousands of years, you see in this period in the distant past that said that the lifespan of human beings was much, much longer than our lifespan, even thousands and thousands of years. So when he grew old, then he addressed his barber. He says, when you see any gray hairs on my head, let me know. Then at a certain point, the barber sees the gray hairs growing. And then at that point, the king decides to go forth and become an ascetic. We could go actually to paragraphs 4, 5, and 6. Here it's speaking about an earlier king named Makadeva. Okay, so the king, when he sees knows that the gray hairs are growing on his head, then he decides to go forth. He entrusts the kingdom to one of his sons, and then he goes off, he puts on the yellow robe of an ascetic, and then he dwells pervading the 4 directions with a mind of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And then when he passes away, then he's reborn in the Brahma-world. Okay, now we'll go to paragraph 21. Okay, so the Buddha now says to Ananda, it may be that you think thus. Certainly on that occasion, someone else was King Makadeva, who instituted that good practice, that is the practice of the 4 divine abodes. But it should not be regarded in this way. I was king, I myself was King Makadeva on that occasion. And I instituted that good practice, and later generations continued that good practice. Okay, but now the Buddha says, this is the important point, that kind of good practice does not lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to the higher peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana, but only to reappearance or rebirth in the Brahma-world. Okay, so the Buddha is now sort of here comparing or pointing out the shortcomings or defects of that good practice. And then he says, but there is this other kind of good practice which has now been started by me, which leads to complete disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, to the higher peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. And what is that good practice? It is the Noble Eightfold Path, starting from right view to right concentration. That is the good practice that I've started now, which leads to complete disenchantment and so on, to nibbana. Okay, so here the Buddha is setting up a contrast between 2 types of good practice. Both are considered good, but one good practice, the Brahma-viharas, leads only to rebirth in the Brahma-world. Sort of that's its limitation. So it's a good practice, a wholesome practice, but on its own, it's still works within the boundaries, we could say, or the limitations of samsara, the round of birth and death. And in contrast, the Buddha is setting up in contrast another good practice, which is the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads to higher realization, to direct knowledge of the liberating truths, to enlightenment and to nibbana. So we could say that the practice of the Brahma-viharas is one of the most excellent practices, but it's still a lokiya practice. It's a mundane practice, a practice within the boundaries or the limits of birth and death, the world of birth and death. But the Noble Eightfold Path is a practice that leads to the transcendence or overcoming of birth and death. Okay, but when we look at it, at the two in this way, it seems almost that there's an exclusive relationship between the two. That the four Brahma-viharas operate entirely within the limits of the world, and in contrast, the Noble Eightfold Path leads beyond the world, but it excludes the four divine abodes. But that would be a misunderstanding. I think maybe in this place the Buddha is setting up such a contrast in order to maybe point out the superiority of the Noble Eightfold Path, or its special uniqueness and a special value. But in fact, what the Buddha does, as we can see from other suttas, is to integrate the Brahma-viharas into his system of training, so that the Brahma-viharas become let us say, an integral part of the training. And so we can see this in a few other suttas, in the Majjhima Nikaya, and then again we'll see in the Anguttara Nikaya. Okay, if we go to Sutta number 62, and we have a series of very short passages beginning with number 18, paragraph 18. This is on page 530. So this is the sutta that the Buddha is addressing to his son Rahula. And here he's explaining different approaches to meditation to Rahula, different ways of training the mind in order to overcome different mental obstructions or mental defilements. And so in paragraph 18, the Buddha instructs Rahula to practice the meditation on loving kindness. For when you develop meditation on loving kindness, any ill will, that's hatred, anger, resentment, and so on, will be abandoned. Okay, so loving kindness is the direct antidote to ill will, hatred, anger. Then develop meditation on compassion. For when you develop meditation on compassion, any cruelty, or maybe that's not exact enough, but it's the impulse of the mind to harm others, to inflict suffering on others. So say a hunter goes hunting for deer or rabbits. He doesn't think of himself as being cruel to the deer or rabbits. He just thinks he's enjoying a sport. But if he develops the meditation on compassion, then that impulse, that urge to engage in some kind of activity that will harm others will be overcome. Or somebody likes to make fun of others, to ridicule others. Well, that could be cruel. To be sarcastic, speak sarcastically to others. Yeah, that could be cruel. But people who do it habitually don't think that they're being cruel. But if they develop compassion, then they will have a feeling of empathy towards others and be able to understand the suffering they experience as a result of sarcastic speech, ridicule, humiliating speech, and so they won't speak in such ways. Okay, then meditation, develop the meditation on mudita, on altruistic joy. For when you develop meditation on altruistic joy, any discontent will be abandoned. The Pali word is arati, which means lack of delight. But usually I think of the opposite of mudita to be envy or jealousy. Because when others achieve success or good fortune, sort of the natural impulse of the undeveloped mind is to envy their good fortune or success. But if one develops mudita, then one is able to rejoice in the good fortune and success of others. Okay, and then the fourth is to develop meditation on equanimity. For when you develop meditation on equanimity, then it says any aversion will be abandoned. And then there's another sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya which says that equanimity is the antidote for attachment or for lust. So it seems to me that equanimity means the balance of mind or impartiality, so that one rises above both special liking and strong and aversion towards others, so that one doesn't have favoritism, show favoritism towards some and aversion towards others. So one regards others equally, even-mindedly, with complete impartiality. Okay, so in this short passage, we see how the four Brahma-viharas can function within the framework of the Buddhist training as ways for overcoming certain mental defilements. And what has to be said about how these four Brahma-viharas eliminate these defilements is that the elimination is not the permanent and ultimate eradication of the defilements, but this is part of the gradual process of overcoming defilements. And technically we say that this is a kind of elimination by factor substitution. It's like using, if there's a rotten peg in a piece of furniture, then we drive out the rotten peg with a new peg, a strong peg. Excuse me? Oh, that was outside. I thought somebody knew a better term for that. Okay. But this method doesn't cut off these defilements at the root. To cut off the defilements, one needs wisdom, the insight into the ultimate truth. But in the process of mental development, we have to first temporarily remove these defilements from the mind. Then when the mind develops what's called a temporary Cheto vimutti, a temporary liberation of mind, or temporary purification of mind, then we can proceed further to develop insight, to arrive at penetrative wisdom, and through penetrative wisdom into the truth of things, then we cut off the defilements right at the root. And then how the defilements are cut off at the root, based on the Brahma-viharas. We could find some examples of this I have two other suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya. Take sutta number 7. And the passage I have in mind begins with section 13. Okay, in the earlier part of the sutta, the Buddha speaks about the elimination of mental defilements. And from some of the terminology used in those passages, we get the clear impression that the monk, he's speaking in terms of a monk, that the monk who has undergone this process of mental purification has already reached one of the 3 lower levels of enlightenment or liberation, either a stream enterer, once returner, or non-returner, but not yet arahant. And we know this from the expression that the monk is said to be one who gains unwavering confidence in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And unwavering confidence is a characteristic of a disciple who has entered the path. So usually one of the 3 lower levels of realization. Okay, so then continuing, the text says that this disciple abides pervading 1/4 with a mind of loving kindness, and so on, then with a mind of compassion, mind of altruistic joy, mind of equanimity. Okay, so now he's developed the 4 Brahma-viharas, or perhaps even just one of them would be enough. Okay, but then he goes on, paragraph 17, he understands thus, there is this, there is the inferior, there is the superior, and beyond there is an escape from this whole field of perception. The passage itself is somewhat obscure, but as explained by the commentary, this passage is a kind of oblique way of expressing the 4 Noble Truths. So what he's understanding, there is this means the set of the 5 aggregates, which is the truth of suffering. There is the inferior, what is low or bad, that is craving, which is the origin of suffering. There is the superior, that would be the cessation of suffering, nibbana, liberation. And beyond there is an escape, a way of escape from this whole field of perception. That could be seen as referring to the Noble Eightfold Path, which leads beyond. Please be quiet, we're having a class here. Okay, so when he sees and when he knows and sees thus, then his mind is liberated from the 3 asavas, the 3 taints. Then when it's liberated, he knows it's liberated, and he understands that he's reached the end of birth and death. Okay, so here, we don't have to go into the details, but here we see that loving kindness, that the 4 Brahma-viharas are used as a meditation subject for the purpose of gaining deep samadhi, for purifying the mind, and then on the basis of that concentrated and purified mind, one develops the insight that brings direct penetration of the 4 Noble Truths, then the eradication of the defilements, and then through eradicating the defilements, vimutti, complete vimutti, liberation. Okay, so this is a passage from Sutta number 7. Then we can take another passage of a similar character this is Sutta number 52. starting with section 8. And in this sutta, which apparently takes place after the Buddha's passing away, a householder named Dasima has come to Venerable Ananda and asked him how a monk who dwells diligently can achieve liberation and reach the destruction of the asavas, the defilements. And so Ananda has been teaching this householder the different methods that can be employed, different methods taught by the Buddha. And so section 8, he says, we have a monk who dwells pervading one quarter with a mind imbued with loving kindness. So the other quarters, up to the whole world, he pervades with loving kindness. Okay, then in the middle of the paragraph, he considers this and understands it thus. This deliverance or liberation of mind through loving kindness is conditioned and volitionally produced. But whatever is conditioned and volitionally produced is impermanent and subject to cessation. So that is the way the monk who attains the liberation of mind by loving kindness turns back, so to speak, and examines that state of mind. And he sees that that state of mind, which is very exalted, very pure, very radiant, he sees that there is the defect in that state of mind, the shortcoming, in that it is conditioned, or it's produced through conditions. It's produced through generating a particular volition to establish a mind of boundless loving kindness. And so it's conditioned, produced through conditions, produced by volition. And because it's conditioned and produced by volition, it's subject to the same, or it's stamped with the same qualities, the same characteristics that everything that is conditioned possesses. Namely, that it's impermanent, that it will come to an end. In the human world, if one enters the liberation of mind by loving kindness, eventually one will emerge from it, and then one will come back to other states of mind. And then if one is reborn in the Brahma-world because of that mind of loving kindness, then one enjoys the bliss and peace and glory of the Brahma-world for could be hundreds of, or thousands of years, millions of years, even several aeons. But eventually that comes to an end, and one has to be reborn elsewhere. So it's impermanent and subject to cessation. So as one is examining this with insight, so if one is really firm and has power, very powerful insight into this, one can attain the destruction of the defilements right on the spot and attain arhatship. But if one's insight is not yet strong enough, then one can attain the stage of non-returning, so that one will be reborn in the Brahma world, but when one is reborn there, one is reborn with the status of a non-returner, so that one will definitely achieve final liberation in that realm without coming back to another rebirth in the lower realm. Okay, so that is the method that the Buddha taught by which one could attain supreme security of bondage or liberation. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask, I think I've gone through the suttas from Majjhima Nikaya that I had lined up. So maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions or comments that arise from these texts. Michael, yeah. And take the microphone, please.
Thank you. There seems to be an implication that one can't advance in the Brahma world. Is that true? In other words...
Okay, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. You're saying that the implication is that one can't advance in the Brahma world.
It appears.
Actually, one can advance in the Brahma world, and one of the suttas from the Anguttara Nikaya that I have lined up will show that one could advance. But let's first take the other questions, and then we'll go on to that text in the Anguttara Nikaya. But just to answer very briefly, one can advance in the Brahma world.
Yeah, I had a question about if is the loving kindness the only way to the Brahman world? Could you get to the Brahman world by doing just regular samadhi meditation, but maybe you don't make it to vipassana or to insight, but you advance, you do some...
Okay, could you either speak more loudly or...
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yeah, what I was asking is loving kindness the only way to the Brahma world? Could you get to the Brahma world by just doing like samadhi practice or jhana practice?
Okay, this is a good question. So he's asking whether the Brahma Viharas are the only way to the Brahma world, or whether one can be reborn in the Brahma world through other types of samadhi practice that reach the level of the jhanas. Actually, even though in the suttas we see when the Buddha is asked about the Brahma world, or when he's teaching the way to the Brahma world, he always mentions the 4 Brahma Viharas. But actually, if we take the wider view that we can see from the commentaries, that through the jhanas one can be reborn in the Brahma world. And what actually brings rebirth in the Brahma world is the power of the samadhi, rather than the particular subject of meditation. And so, the way the scheme is developed, I think we see this already in the suttas, but it becomes more explicit in the commentaries. The form realm is divided into 4 levels, and then each level is subdivided into 3 secondary levels. And so it's said that if one develops the first jhana, which can be through any meditation subject, it can be through mindfulness of breathing, through loving kindness or compassion or altruistic joy, or it can be through a colored disc, what they call the kasina. Whatever object one uses, if one develops the first jhana without going higher, that will lead to rebirth in the first, we call this the first level of the form realm. If one goes further and develops the second jhana, then that will lead to rebirth in the second level of the form realm. If one develops the third jhana,